you're joining us from the East Coast, and good morning if you're in WA. My name is Venus Khalessi, and on behalf of the Australian Baha'i Community, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this Explainer webinar on the Facebook news ban in a conversation exploring observations, implications, as well as possibilities for the path ahead. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land from where I'm connecting into this webinar today. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends who are joining today's webinar. We've been joined today by participants from all over the country, and it's so wonderful to see Australians from all walks of life interested and engaged in this important conversation. In recognition of the significant role the media plays in shaping public discourse and in turn the public sphere, the Australian Baha'i Community is dedicated to strengthening the conversation about how the media, a vital component of our society, can best serve the growing needs of our country and in turn contribute to vibrant and cohesive communities. But we appreciate that this is a shared undertaking, and today's webinar is one such example of this effort, thanks to some of the industry's most experienced and respected minds who, in light of recent events, have joined us in this conversation as we more closely examine the intersection of technology, communications, and the role of the media in society. It goes without saying that online technologies have significantly disrupted how we consume media content, and our news landscape is increasingly complex. Luckily, today we're joined by a number of great minds who can help us to navigate through our questions. And this includes Professor Derek Wilding, who is the co-director of the Centre for Media Transition, based at the University of Technology, Sydney, as well as Dr. Chrisanthi Giotis, a postdoctoral research fellow also with the CMT. The Centre for Media Transition is an interdisciplinary research centre dedicated to investigating media evolution and transition, including journalism and industry best practice, as well as understanding how digital transition can be harnessed to develop and enhance the role of journalism in society. Also joining us today is Dr. Anne Kruger, who is the Asia Pacific Director of First Draft, an NGO whose mission is to protect communities from harmful misinformation. First Draft works to empower society with the knowledge, understanding, and tools needed to outsmart false and misleading information. We are also very grateful to be joined today together with Professor Peter Greste in his capacity as the UNESCO Chair for Journalism and Communications. Professor Greste is based at the University of Queensland, where he leads research and public debate about the future of journalism so that it can best serve its many roles. His focus has been on the intersection between media freedom and national security, leading a research program and engaging with policymakers, advocacy groups, and the media. Well, a very warm welcome to each of you, and thank you for joining this conversation, which seeks to serve all Australians. Given that these introductions do not adequately convey the depth of experience you each bring to this conversation, we've provided links to individual biographies, which is available and accessible to all of you in the chat in an effort to make most of our time together. Well, let's get straight to it. Derek, perhaps you can kick off our discussions by helping to address the question at the forefront of everyone's minds. What led to the 6-day news ban experienced by some 18 million Australians on Facebook in mid-February, and what was its significance?
Great, thanks very much, Venus. Yeah, it is an interesting and quite big question. I guess the short answer to what led to it is that it looked like a piece of legislation was about to pass the Australian Parliament that would result in Facebook being designated and have certain responsibilities as a result of that. So that would have meant that Facebook had to engage in bargaining with news media businesses in a regulated way, and it could be forced into arbitration under an act of Parliament. Facebook was willing to strike agreements with news media providers to remunerate them for the use of its content in a certain way, but it didn't want to do that in this regulated form and under this proposed act. So that's what led to the temporary ban. That's, I guess, the short answer. But the backstory in a way is as interesting because, you know, while it came to a head just a few weeks ago, it had actually been building for over 3 years, and the origins, in a way, can be seen in a previous round of legislative reform, which was changes to the media laws back in 2017. And at that point, the last of Australia's cross-media ownership laws was removed, along with some other changes. And in exchange for that, when the government was trying to get that piece of legislation through Parliament, it agreed to the ACCC being directed to conduct its digital platform inquiry. So at that point of the media reform legislation, it was already obvious that there'd been some huge changes in the media environment since the last round of media reform about 10 years before. So we'd seen the effects really in that period of increased digitization, whereby businesses like Seek and realestate.com and Domain had taken the classified advertising revenue that had previously gone to newspapers and that had drifted to other providers. We'd also seen the arrival of international news organisations in Australia, like the BBC, and some of whom, like the Guardian and Daily Mail, had employed local journalists. And then lastly, we'd seen the arrival of digital platforms, and that's kind of what brings us to this particular issue. So we get people finding their news in via different sources, and to some extent staying within those environments or using them as gateways to news sites. So some dramatic changes from what had taken place over the previous 10 or 15 years. And the ACCC was tasked with looking at the last of those, which was the effect of digital platforms. Its investigation covered a really wide range of issues, including, say, copyright law and privacy law. But perhaps the most important aspect was, for this purpose, was the finding that Google and Facebook, not other digital platforms, but those two, have market power in certain markets in Australia. And so that sense of their prominence, if not dominance, within certain markets, the fact that they're unavoidable business partners for news media organisations gave the ACCC, or the government, a platform to introduce a new regulatory environment, or to pass legislation that would attempt to regulate these platforms to some extent. And so I think that's come to the last aspect of your question, the significance of it. I think that's probably, the significance is seen both in the flow of revenue, I think, from the digital platforms to news media organisations, and hopefully assisting them in the sustainability that it's been so difficult within this new environment and the loss of revenue. But also there's the other element of the varied attempts to bring digital platforms within the regulatory framework in Australia and in other countries around the world. So while this is one of a kind, and it's not the same approach that's being taken in other domains and in other kinds of regulation, it is, in a sense, a successful attempt to regulate the conduct of digital platforms, even if the legislation itself never directly applies to them. Nevertheless, it's led to a change in conduct and certain arrangements being struck.
Okay, that's really helpful, because I think none of this happened in a void, or it didn't just emerge overnight. It's part of a longer narrative, and it's very helpful to be able to understand what that longer narrative is. But looking actually at the events around the time of the 18th of February and the 6 days following, and what were some of the challenges and concerns which emerged as a result of this decision to no longer have like news in our news feeds effectively?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Is that to Anne? Or
Derek, if...
No, you go, Anne. You go.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Venus. And I'd just like to acknowledge the Yagara-related people, the traditional custodians of the land of which I'm joining from. But I can answer this by going back and looking at some analysis from the data analytics company Chartbeat, which actually showed the evening before the restrictions took place, there was a normal plateau of Facebook traffic in the afternoon. Then you have this normal dip in the evening when everyone's going to sleep on Wednesday night. And then the following morning, the traffic started to creep up, as it would on a typical day, even quite early. And then, of course, when Facebook, I guess, turned off the tap with the news restrictions, that came into a place at around 5:30 in the morning, Sydney time. And within 24 hours, we saw that Facebook had sent just 14,000 page views to Australian publishers, which is the equivalent of a 93% drop. We compare that to the day before, it sent 201,000 page views from memory. It didn't go to zero because there are a few publisher links that were already on Facebook homepages and older links were posted before the shut off. There's also some grey areas. We saw some politicians still being able to post links, for example, in our monitoring. And we don't have exact data on how this was rolled out as well, of course, too. So you talk about some of the implications and the ramifications. Well, the First Nations Media Association expressed outrage at Indigenous voices being included in the cutoff, even if it was accidental. Indigenous organisations such as the Aboriginal Medical Services Alliance in the Northern Territory, Central Australian Aboriginal Congress and the Danila Dilba Health Service had their pages blocked. The following day, many of them appeared to be back online, but the Danila Dilba Health Service noted that there was this importance not only of health organisations, but also media to the Indigenous community due to its high-risk health needs. Now, in terms of disinformation, which is where we look, where we work, and misinformation at First Draft, around this time, we had noticed there was a real concerted campaign on Instagram and Facebook using the hashtag #JustAsking. Very subtle kind of a hashtag. There were high-profile Instagram wellness anti-vaccine advocates who make money out of this as a lifestyle advocacy. So, make no mistake there. They were sharing this hashtag, and basically they were calling for a COVID-19 anti-vaccination video campaign that was targeting Indigenous populations. They were calling for this to go viral. And they have influencers, prominent influencers who've got tens of thousands of followers between Facebook and Instagram. Some of the techniques that they use is they'll post on their sites a screenshot of newspaper articles that might actually be showing positive stories, of an Indigenous woman, in one example, who was encouraging vaccination in her community. But this anti-vaccination advocate juxtaposed this report on their post and just has this subtle "just asking" hashtag. Now, it's not easy to sow doubt. So from our research in particular, we look at communities that are targeted. We see even worldwide that there's these two sort of main buckets of techniques where you can use convincing themes and misinformation, whether it's hashtags and memes, to really sort of sow doubt. One of the buckets is surrounding politics and economics, and the other is safety and efficacy of vaccines. So, the politics and economics, why should we trust governments? It's not hard to sow that doubt when you look at recent history and when you look at history as well and different things that occur. And of course, when it comes to safety and efficacy of vaccines, the wellness community uses this, listen to your body type of techniques rather than science, because with the former, it's quite easy to make that sound attractive or appealing. So, we did see that the Australian public broadcaster ABC, it rose to number 2 in the App Store's free app chart on February 19. That's according to Sensor Tower data. But Australian media in general seem to have taken a direct hit immediately following Facebook's action. And there are other pages that we know that were affected as well, including domestic violence and children's health. sites as well. But definitely, you know, according to the data from Chartbeat, when the Facebook traffic dropped off, overall, the Australian traffic didn't seem to shift to other platforms. We did some checks on Google Trends, and there was some evidence when people were searching up about what was going on with the Facebook restrictions. There were search terms, you know, Facebook, why Facebook bans Australian news, why did Facebook ban Australian news, or blocking news, those sorts of terms. But at the top of that was MeWe. So, you know, looking at alternative platforms, MeWe. I just wanted to point out, though, what we have actually seen with our research, and I need to have a giant caveat here as well, that you know, there's a few restrictions on our research, but we did analyse the top 30 Facebook pages using COVID and vaccine related posts. So specifically looking at those COVID vaccine posts, we thought, right, give us the top 30, what comes back before the ban and during. So before the ban, just looking at our observations at those COVID and vaccine posts, we took it back to the 1st of January and right up to the 16th of January, just looking at, you know, the returns there. And in the top 30 was predominantly all news websites, you know, all of your major news websites there. Plus you had state premiers, you had Scott Morrison, who rounded out that. So, you know, not surprisingly, that's what we saw. There were two exceptions in that top 30. One was related to a basketball page and one was called COVID Pete site. So I'll let you, you know, think of that as you might. Not unexpected with what was going on. Now, during the restrictions though, so we looked from February 18 to February 24 with our data, and we showed, in place of those news websites, looking again at the COVID vaccine pages, there was really this 50-50 between authoritative voices like the politicians and the health departments. We saw a lot more, you know, health departments, state health department pages come up, and there was one serious sort of commentator, a doctor who was commentating, but the other 50%, the remainder, included conspiratorial theory groups, fringe political groups, far right supporters, and there was also a lot of comedy and satire, including an Indian actor and a fan page and a poetry page as well. So I really think of this as this 50-50. You've got the authoritative voices and then this mix of conspiratorial and comedy and satire. A couple of things we can't explain. In that top 30, you still saw Sky News and ABC towards the bottom, but I think that's just because we don't know exactly how the rollout worked and they may have been partially restored. Yeah, so we need some more data on that. But in 31st place, so we just want to look at one more, we happened to notice that there was a particular fringe medical party post that came right after the ABC, which was sitting at 30. This came in, yes, at 31. Whereas before, pre-ban, this came in at 277th. Okay, so the 277th most popular page. So we can see, you know, the effects of what's happening here. Perhaps it's not particularly surprising, but that page that went from 277 and jumped up was one of those sites that were particularly targeting the Aboriginal and Indigenous communities with some of those techniques that I mentioned earlier. So, you know, there's some interesting questions here that I'm sure we'll be discussing more, but, you know, Facebook's alerting people to go to the official authoritative COVID-19 sites and sources. You know, it's interesting to get a bit more data on, you know, what effect does that have? And I'm curious in particular when you think about people's everyday feeds. So yes, there are a lot more, you know, with the you know, the health departments, and they were a lot higher in our returns during the ban. So that looks like it's encouraging news. But I'm quite interested in, you know, is it a conscious decision that people make when they're going to click on these sites, or is it just whatever kind of turns up in their news feed? So there might be alerts to go here for more information, but if you're scrolling through that sort of subliminal kind of activity that we have, scrolling through and what pops up and what do we interact with, I think that's something that I think would be an area of interest for further research, just to see how people really access news and where they'll come across this quality information.
Well, speaking of habits, I mean, and responding to those, to the void, Chrisanthi, you've looked at some ways in which Australians responded to the absence of media and news content on the platform. So, I mean, Anne's spoken to this prevalence of mis and disinformation, but in the absence of media and news content, how did Australians respond to actually seek truth? And you're just on mute at the moment.
Thank you, Venus. Yeah, can I just acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as well, where UTS stands. So this is really interesting because you have this double role of platforms. So on the one hand, they're fantastic at providing an alternate public sphere, and like Anne mentioned, the loss of some of the really important information for specific communities like the Indigenous community was a huge loss, right? They should never have been targeted or swept up in it. And the reason that they were swept up in it is because what platforms have done is actually put the means of production, so actually given small organizations the ability to become their own news providers. And we know that in the past, they had a lot of trouble breaking into the mainstream. So you have this issue where minorities are actually being able to use the platforms to get their message out. On the other hand, we know definitively that one of the main results of platforms is increasing xenophobia and xenophobic content. Okay, that's been shown without doubt. So you have this situation where you have this space, this new public sphere, which is both empowering and disempowering. And then all of a sudden it disappears as a place of information where mainstream media information is found. And so you have, ordinary people like my mum, who is not on any platforms, saying, but isn't that a good thing? Because now people will go direct to authoritative news sources. Like, isn't this actually a good thing? And then you have actually the fact that an organization like the ABC uses a platform like Facebook to try and get hard to reach consumers. So people who they wouldn't normally see as their target demographic. And you actually had, during the ban, you had the ABC app go up. Like, so downloads of the ABC app skyrocketed during those few days. What we don't know is whether those people were people who would actually normally consume the ABC anyway and are going on Facebook. One of their main reasons is to consume the ABC, or whether that also included some people who are like, oh, hang on, my Facebook has gotten a bit more boring, so maybe I should grab the app. Like I'm not scrolling as long on Facebook, like maybe I should grab the app. Even better, there might actually have been, and this is what I hope happened, and which I saw some evidence of because of the number of people who are saying, maybe this is a good thing. People who thought, oh, I need to take a bit more control of my consumption of news. I've let too much control go to the platforms. I'm not in control of this. And this is something which the very, very good media theorist Dana Boyd raised way back in 2007, that what we actually need to pay attention to in this multimedia online era is the flow of information. So it's how that information is flowing around and getting to us and empowering us as citizens. And yeah, we just actually don't have a very good flow at the moment. You know, if the facts are showing, if all the research is showing that, you know, increase in misinformation, increase in xenophobia, then that's not a good flow. This is not the public sphere that we want to see. And that isn't actually a fault of the technology itself, because we also know that the technology can be empowering. So it's actually a fault of the flow and the way that we're using it, but also we have to ask, is there some sort of positive obligation that can go to the platforms themselves in terms of giving us a better flow? And yeah, what I was enthused by and what made me think that this could have positive ramifications is the number of people who actually became more aware of their media consumption during this time.
Yeah, well, you've certainly raised some important points here that we will delve into a little bit later, particularly about this concept of being a passive consumer to someone who has agency and is active and conscious of their choices and decisions and consumption online. Peter, I'd like to throw it over to you. You've spoken about some of the more hopeful observations that also Chrisanthi's alluded to about our relationship with media and news content. So what were your observations, or how would you speak to some of these implications in terms of how Australians responded to all of this in those 6 days and what we've learned from it since?
Yeah, thanks, Venus. And I think that, look, as everyone has highlighted, we saw that surge in downloads of the ABC News app, which indicated, even though it was inconsistent, as Anne has pointed out, there was a recognition amongst Australians that news actually matters, and that there was value in going directly to the source of that news. I also think that it highlighted the need for us to really recognise or think of news as a public good. One of the problems is that on Facebook and Twitter, news tends to disappear. All information looks much the same, and it made people, the absence of news online made people consider and think about its role as a public good more seriously. Now, of course, we all know that people are very cynical about journalism and the news organisation, but I think it's often easier to see its value when we don't have it, when it's taken away from us. And I think to a certain extent, that's what Facebook revealed. One of the things though that I'm interested in, and I think, and this is something that you might be able to help me with, is the extent to which the top-rated news websites, or the top-rated website pages rather on Facebook, are driven there by the algorithms themselves, whether they're a product of the algorithms or a product of choices that people make. Because one of the things, of course, that Facebook tends to do is presents itself as a neutral platform. It presents itself simply as presenting a stage on which people are allowed to make decisions on their own. But of course, the algorithms are highly influential. They directly influence the way that we consume, the way we consume Facebook. And I think that it's easy to forget that those are fundamentally editorial decisions. Now, those editorial decisions that the platforms are making are driven by, not by the same sorts of editorial priorities that a news editor would make when they're putting together a news website. They're driven by the Facebook, the social media company's imperative to harness our attention. But that doesn't mean that they're not making those editorial decisions. And I think that if you take these two elements together, what you come up with is a deep understanding of the need to have genuinely curated news that's curated by humans who understand the news environment, and the need also to treat news as a public good rather than a commercial commodity, something that we actually need as a community more than we need as a series of businesses.
Well, there are some really great points here that you've raised, Peter, that I'd like to actually build on. I'm very conscious, though, we only do have an hour together. So maybe what we can do now is move on to this notion of an ever-evolving ecosystem and actually draw on that as a springboard to look at this notion of news or media as a public good. So what we've seen with the media ecosystem is that it's evolved extensively over the last 10 to 15 years, and it's by no means a static landscape. Digital disruption has impacted how we produce and consume media and news content. Like you've mentioned here, platforms can draw on these algorithms, which then make choices about what we see and how we consume the information. Platforms have also created numerous pressures. There's a growing attention deficit. There's this, chase for eyeballs. It's also created new opportunities. For example, there's a greater diversity of stories and voices that can be heard, as Chrisanthi alluded to. And also, Anne, you mentioned some of the impact that it had on Indigenous communities and also the development of their media. It also allows us to see, different ways of how events and experiences are reported and understood. So overall, technology has brought many pressures, but it's also integrated and enabled us to be more interconnected than ever before as members of one global community. Now, the implications of this are all vast, and you can see the positives and the negatives. But it's also enabled us to have this very strong symbiotic relationship between news producers and news consumers. So against this backdrop, and given that this ecosystem will continue to evolve and mature, how would you describe some of the features of a fair and just media system that serves consumers and producers alike? What are some of the things that we want to take forward with us, and particularly the values, and what should we phase out? And I think, maybe Derek, you could even start by helping us build on this idea of, journalism as a public good. What are the implications of this? And what values then present itself, drawing on an understanding of journalism as a public good?
I think it was a really critical moment where there was this public acknowledgement of the status of journalism in this way. And it even got to the point of the Treasurer and the Communications Minister recognising that and speaking in those terms, which I think was a bit of a turning point and important for addressing the financial problems that media is facing, but also looking towards the future. I agree with Peter very much, actually, in the point about distinguishing between what news does and what platforms do, and keeping those separate. In fact, it's a reason why I don't think that platforms should be regulated as publishers. There's often a lot of calls for platforms to be regulated as publishers. I think that kind of algorithmic curation that Peter was describing is something quite different from the editorial curation that he was also talking about. And so I certainly believe in bringing platforms within the regulatory framework, but not in the same terms. Public good is kind of critical to that because there's this other side to it in which, well, first of all, it enables, I think, things to be done in the name of news that you wouldn't expect for others. So, a range of businesses might be affected by decisions that Facebook makes about changes to its algorithms. So any kind of online business that's selling any kind of goods might actually be affected by sudden algorithmic changes. And we're not suggesting that there should be any kind of regulation of that across the board. News is in a different category because of this function that it fulfills within democratic society. And that's why it's, in a sense, getting this special treatment. It's because it fulfills that role. But the other side of that is, I think, there are certain expectations that come with that as well. And it's reasonable to assume that there are certain responsibilities that news providers have that others don't. And so that's things like media standards around accuracy and fairness, transparency, respect for privacy, etc., that we do expect of news providers, and that we don't expect necessarily of other kinds of information providers. So I think going forward, it's important to keep that in mind, that yes, we need to kind of make this acknowledgement of public good status, ensure that there are indeed some other initiatives beyond the News Media Bargaining Code, like looking at, say, tax rebates for production and rebates for consumers that take up subscriptions, offsets for producers that actually make the product. But there's the other side of it as well, which is the responsibilities that come with it.
And Anne, I know that first draft really works closely with journalists and media organizations to help cultivate and build on some of those capacities to really raise the standard of journalism, as this public good, as this shared asset of our society. Do you have any thoughts around the types of values that we want to take forward with us in this ever-evolving ecosystem, and what we want to phase out as we continue to evolve?
Yeah, well, I think just in terms of thinking about the algorithms, I think that's actually something that we can discuss a bit here as well, and the role that journalists can take as well as platforms, and just in part to reflect on Peter's mention there about the algorithms and whether or not that's directed traffic. I think of it in terms of what are people searching and what are people looking for. And not only Facebook, but on Google and Google search, what's the information that people are looking for, and then of course we don't have the information about how exactly the algorithms work, but that will bring up certain alerts if you're looking at Facebook, or will it drive people to certain sites, and how exactly does that work? I agree, we need more information about that. But the other thing too is that we need to be better communicators as far as journalists go. And of course, we need better resources and sustainable resources for this to take place and for this to be done. I think misinformation isn't the whole picture when you're thinking about quality information out there, in particular about vaccines, because if you eradicate the misinformation on the platforms, people still have legitimate concerns and questions about vaccines, about COVID-19, about other pieces of information, other issues as well, not just vaccines, but that's what we're focused on at the moment. So I think if you want to get good quality information out there and to counter message, we have to really understand those legitimate questions and concerns and be really much more preemptive. And that's something that we encourage our journalism members to do. And that's something that we sort of feed through daily to our members, and as well as civil society organisations more and more now. So in terms of thinking about the algorithms, if you've got, authoritative health sources that are moving up in interactions, we can argue this is potentially a good thing, because we need more, but I think that's not the only thing. We need more journalism that really focuses on the data deficits, and we've seen a lot of data deficits throughout the pandemic that then get filled with misinformation, or they just don't get filled with the information that is really handy for people straight away. They've got that access to it quickly. And that's something that I would like to see us really sort of arm journalists with those skills a bit more as well. And we can talk about it later as well, but there's a whole media literacy, news literacy aspect to this too. So it's very much multi-pronged, this whole approach. You've got your platforms, government intervention, but it's also, what are the practices and that journalists and civil society organisations can think about too when they're really serving the needs of communities and their audiences.
Well, thank you, Anne. Chrisanthi, thinking of, having understood journalism as a public good, what do you see to be the features of a fair and just media system that can serve consumers and producers alike, in light of the contributions that Anne and Derek have made, but also in light of the work that you've undertaken as well?
Yeah, so if I can just build on what Anne was saying, I think that she really brought up a super important point, because what happened with the advent of the internet and then platforms is that they created an economic crisis in journalism, right? And that economic crisis and the chasing of clicks online led journalists to forget their philosophical basis, which is the public, right? And so what Anne is talking about there is, let's refocus on the public and what they need at this moment in time. And Venus, you raised earlier the symbiotic relationship between journalism and democracy. And actually, the basis, the praxis for both of those terms is the public. And it's not clear that this is the basis for technology companies. even though so much of the public sphere has moved there. So I think if we're talking about a fair and just media ecosystem, we have to find out how much of this responsibility, how much of the public sphere are these technology companies willing to take on and to be responsible for. We ourselves have to take responsibility as citizens, because without, participation, then democracy is meaningless. We have to take responsibility as journalists. And, earlier I talked about the fact that news organizations try to reach hard to reach news consumers on platforms. Well, is that the best way? Actually, my research in trust with minority Australian groups shows that that isn't the best way, because they do actually find mainstream social media to be a place where they are attacked. And so they don't want to be on there. And the thing that makes them trust journalists again is if journalists actually go out and talk to them, and that's been incredibly powerful. And I think you've seen that in your work too, Venus. So yeah, we do have to think about a fair and just media ecosystem as being about conscious choices on the part of media professionals, on the part of technology organizations. Specifically, there is work being done overseas around this idea of positive obligations. Technology organizations are corporate citizens as well. So even if their philosophical basis is not the public, they're still corporate citizens. And that needs to be taken into account. And yeah, I would say that that's something that we really need to think about.
Peter, what are your thoughts around this? You were the one that initially raised journalism as this public good. So what values do you seek?
I think one of the things we need to, one of the oldest adages in journalism is follow the money. Money changes everything. If you understand the way the money works, then you can understand, and if you can understand the environment. If you can control the money, you can also control the environment. And I think that is also true of the news industry as much as it is of the tech industry. One of the things that this showed us is one of the values, one of the things that made news effective in the old days was the way in which the source of revenue was disconnected from journalism. Most of the revenue came from small classified ads, and those advertisers really weren't influenced in any way by the journalism, and likewise journalists really weren't, they didn't allow the influence of those advertisers to affect their journalism. And so editors were able to, and journalists were able to make editorial decisions that were based on their experience. They understood the stories and they covered the stories, often to sell newspapers, yes, but also they had enough space, enough revenue, and enough independence from commercial pressure to be able to do stories for their own sake, because they were in what a lot of journalists called worthy. Not necessarily sexy news stories, but worthy because they're important and worth covering. The problem now, of course, is the way in which news revenue is so closely tied to clicks in ways that it hasn't been before. Now, I know that that's shifted a little bit with the move towards subscription as a source of revenue, but nonetheless, what the result of the bargaining code crisis and the Facebook decision to ban showed, what that result was a flow of money, was an agreement to send money back into news organizations, which allowed them, the main news organizations, the big ones, which allowed them to source money that was all of a sudden independent of political pressure, and also to a certain extent independent of commercial pressure. They had a source of money that wasn't reliant on clicks. I don't think this is a viable solution, because it also doesn't provide the same flow of revenue to small local and hyper-local news organizations, which are often the drivers of community news, community information. They're the kinds of local news services that hold a lot of the smaller regional communities together, and also the more distinct ethnic and special interest communities within our own cities. And so it's a flawed solution, but it highlights the need for to provide a source of revenue to news organisations that is both independent of commercial pressure and political influence. If we can achieve that, then I think we'll be a long way towards achieving the kinds of goals that Derek, Chrisanthi and Anne have all been speaking about. But that's, if there is one takeaway lesson, I think, from this whole news media bargaining code crisis, it's that we need to rethink the way that we pay for news. I think that the solution the government has come up with is imperfect, but it is a recognition that we need to find another way of paying for news.
You know, there's been so many incredible points raised here, and I think this, just to restate the principle that you've raised here, Peter, about how we can have a model which is free from vested, whether it's private or public interest. That's a really key point here. And whether there's actually a role for government, you know, if this is, given that this is a shared public good, it really indicates that, you know, every organ of society is clearly interlinked here, and that we are inextricably linked, that we have this complementary role which enables us to collectively flourish if we place that shared sphere, that public good at the center, and then think about how we can all collectively contribute to it, because it has huge implications to the well-being of the whole, whether it's individuals, communities, or institutions. And so maybe it is calling for a shared ethic here. The other thing that I think was really interesting was this notion of journalism as a process. I think, Chrisanthi, you mentioned this, and that's what really differentiates, you know, sources of information that randomly circulate, you know, online in the digital sphere, because what journalism offers as well is an opportunity to give weight to empirical information. It gives us an opportunity to go beyond the raising mere opinion to the status of fact, but really looking at the scientific patterns that are unfolding, where there's consensus, and presenting information in a way that's actually becomes knowledge for the collective benefit of everyone. And maybe it's those elements as well that enables it to become this public good that we have identified to be so valuable, particularly in times of crisis like the bushfires. Many editors speak to the fact that subscriptions spike during these times. The pandemic was also has been also a fantastic example about you know, the pure value of journalism to be our eyes and ears as well, when we were otherwise in lockdown or couldn't make sense of what the new regulations were, and the way in which also the media and government did work hand in hand to share that knowledge for the collective benefit of the whole. So there's certainly a lot here that you know, we could explore more deeply about values and the way in which we want this ecosystem to continue to mature. But I also wanted to just mention the role of justice in terms of sharing stories, not only of those of the privileged few who perhaps have the opportunity to have their narrative showcased, or often things are, like you mentioned, Peter, in particular, you mentioned like stories are driven in a way which, or curated in a way which attracts eyeballs. But what about the stories that offer hope or shed light on the positive experiences of communities and populations that are actually responding to moving through times of crisis and building vibrant and resilient communities? And there's a strong feedback loop as well, because it gives an opportunity for a population or community to be mirrored in a way which you know, is not just a negative light, but also the positive experiences and contributions that they're making. So there's so much here to unpack and explore. Are there any final thoughts on this question in light of everyone's contributions that any of you wish to add at this point before we move on to the last section of our discussions?
Venus, I just want to sort of expand on that point just very briefly, that I think most journalists also feel that you know, a real sense of social mission and purpose, but you can't do that if you haven't got the money that allows you to do those sorts of things. You know, the kind of as you've said, producing stories that highlight the positive is great, but we also know that those stories aren't always the ones that get shared on social media. Those aren't always the ones that generate the clicks. It's quite important for everyone to understand that what we consider to be good, serious, sober journalism is both difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. And at the moment, the business models don't allow, don't encourage, don't support that kind of journalism. We need to recognize, yes, of course, journalists have a responsibility, but we're never going to get that responsibility fulfilled if we don't find a way of paying for it in a way that supports the public interest rather than the commercial interest. And I think if there, as I said earlier, if there is one big lesson out of this Facebook debacle, I won't call it a debacle, but this crisis, it showed it's the need to do precisely that.
Absolutely. I mean, like, that's the beauty, I think, of long form journalism, when journalists are able to be given the time, the space, and the resources to delve deeper. Then they're able to offer color, complexity, nuance to a story, rather than being caught in the bucket and in the nuggets and bites of information, and definitely working towards a structure that supports those opportunities and allows for complexity to be shared through journalism really strikes at the heart of this conversation.
Venus,
yes,
I might just briefly add, and it needs to be sustainable. And I'm sure this is the point we're all getting at anyway, but it needs to be sustainable, because we see a lot of funding, not even if you're just looking at the main news organisations, but say some of the like fact-checking units and other types of journalism, they have to survive on yearly funding, so annual funds. And it's not sustainable. You know, you don't know, can you expand your unit? You've got your impacts, you know, can you leverage your impacts and keep doing that? And when you're spending your time, you know, talking to funders and trying to just hope that you can shore things up for another year, that's not sustainable, and that's not helpful to what our aims are.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, we have to recast these bigger questions around how it's you know, funded and supported by all of us. Actually, we all have a role to play here, because it is that shared good. Well, noting time and the fact that, you know, we really did want to also explore this one other question now that comes up time and time over about social media and how we can navigate it more thoughtfully and conscientiously. I mean, it is this uninhibited realm. Things can quickly be amplified, magnified. Feelings are stirred in a variety of ways. Sometimes things might seem harmless or well-intentioned, but when you look deeper, there's maybe some intention to fuel divides or differences between opposing groups and perpetuate disagreements. And this ultimately places pressure on our sense of cohesion and the strength of our social fabric. So over to each of you. In the last couple of minutes that we have together, what advice can you offer to Australians who are seeking to navigate news content and online technologies more thoughtfully and conscientiously? Chrisanthi, what are your thoughts here? You're on mute first.
Sorry, Venus, double whammy. This is actually something that I really read this morning that stuck with me, and that's why I was late. Apologies, my panelists was stressing you out. We need to think whether we are the citizen that democracy needs. Like, so thinking about that as organizations, as media organizations, and as individuals, you know, are we being the citizen that democracy needs? So are there conversations that would be better offline? You know, if we are sharing information, you know, are we sharing information that plays to the attention economy, to our base amygdala sense of fear, which is still there, or are we actually sharing information which is about the community building capacity of human beings, which is what has created civilization? You know, I know that sounds very grand, but it's actually very simple acts that is doing this. And yeah, that's it. Simple as that. Are we the citizen that democracy needs?
It's a very Powerful question there. And you've often spoken to a 7-second rule. What are the types of things that we need to be considering in those 7 seconds when we are wanting to share or, you know, react to content online?
Yeah, I think this is about people just using their critical thinking a little bit more and also good old-fashioned common sense. But I think this is something where we're really needing to focus more on that news literacy, that media literacy as well. And so the 7-second delay is really that, I mean, we're very visual creatures and we react to emotions. And of course, that's what, you know, gets shared around social media. But a lot of people will make their decisions once they've just read a headline or they've seen a picture, and then they'll put their emoji on or they'll share and they'll, you know, be angry, make their statement. They haven't read the whole article. So my challenge to everyone in Australia is never ever share anything unless you have read the whole article. And this is something I do. I read right from top to the bottom, even if it's something I'm sharing with my colleagues in emails and things, because there could just be that one little thing that I go, whoops, that's not going to reflect so well on me. But this is, you know, the design of social media where, well, not so much social media, but the agents of disinformation, where they're really trying to appeal to emotion. So a couple of things to think about is look at the language. Is this actually trying to instill an emotion, a reaction, something angry in me? That's a bit of a sign that you might be getting played here. So really read into what the post is and think about that. Also look at who is putting this post up in the first place, you know, and do a little bit of background on them. Look at their profile. What sort of stuff do they usually send? Look at their about page. Who are they associated with? And just look, I know people are going to say, I don't want to do this all the time. I don't have time. It's fine for us where, you know, in this industry, of course, we'll do it. But I just think if people have some experience of doing this, they'll at least be aware that these are some steps that I need to think about and take. And even if I don't do it for every time, just hold off on sharing it and know there could be more to it. We're really good in Australia at rolling out in schools, you know, safety campaigns, cyber safety. There's been a lot of work done there by the government and civil society. I would love to see that effort being put into thinking about news literacy and where that fits into media literacy as a part of, you know, digital literacy as well. And not only to, you know, school students, but, you know, we've got to get this throughout the generations as well, because we know it's misinformation being shared in older generations on WhatsApp is a big problem as well. But it's that critical thinking. I don't care if you've had 20 of your best mates that have liked it and shared it as well. If it's 20 times 0 verification and quality in there, it's still 0. We all know that. Basic maths. So they're just a few things to start with. And everyone have a play occasionally on reverse image search. When you see a picture and if something's really appealing, do a reverse image search, which basically means put it into Google Images, see what comes up. And so many times, you know, it's an image that was actually from 2 years ago. It's being rehashed in some way to try to make a point about something that's happening now as if it was new. And unfortunately, by the time you get the fact checks in about that, people have made up their mind and it's gone viral. So there's some fun things that people can do. I would love for people to just take the time and really think about these processes at least once or twice. Then if you don't want to have to deal with that all the time, at least you know what those processes are. It's like when we answer the phone and it's a scam call. We know what's at stake here. Someone's trying to sell me something. Something's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's sort of this invitation to see the world through our own eyes, really, and not just to assume that what someone has shared with us, even if they might be a family member or a friend, not to just look through their eyes, but actually, see things critically and analytically, and also not to be a passive consumer of content and really draw on our sense of agency. It's also really interesting, Anne, because it shows that we all have an invitation here to take collective responsibility, not to amplify harmful content, that we all as individuals have a role to play. We're all protagonists of this online environment. We're all content creators and distributors. So we sort of, all share together this collective sense of responsibility for the well-being of the whole. So really appreciate those thoughts there. Peter, you often speak to a healthy news diet. I'm really conscious we have gone over time, but we do have a long weekend ahead of us. So hopefully we can sort of stick around for a couple of more minutes. And I appreciate that those that do need to leave, people will need to leave at this point. And if they do, that's fine. But while we still are together for these last couple of minutes, what advice do you give? How do you speak to this healthy news diet? What does that involve? What are its implications? Over to you.
Look, it's pretty simple. We all know that if all we consume is McDonald's, then we'll end up with a pretty solid dose of diabetes and also amongst all sorts of other health issues. So much of what circulates on social media is the digital equivalent of McDonald's. And so, we know that it's fine to have some of that stuff, but you've also got to eat your greens. I know some of the challenges I have getting our kids to finish off their greens, but it's an essential part of a good, healthy existence. And so, in news terms, that means consciously reading consuming a diverse range of news from those news services that you would recognize as high quality, reading stuff that you wouldn't normally read even if you're not particularly interested in politics or economics or foreign affairs, spending a bit of time, setting a bit of time aside to deliberately read that kind of stuff. I think that generally makes us, if we're making conscious, deliberate decisions about the news that we consume rather than reactively and passively consuming it in the way that Anne has spoken, then I think we're moving a long way towards having a much healthier news diet.
Thank you. And Derek, what advice would you give? You've worked in a variety of settings, and before you were at the Centre for Media Transition. What are your thoughts around this question in terms of thoughtful and conscious and conscientious consumption of news content, but also how we navigate online technologies?
Yeah, well, they're great comments from all three of my journalist colleagues here, and I'm a regulatory person, so I guess I'd say don't give up on journalism standards, media standards, and if you see information, news reports that you don't think quite meet the standards that they should, there are ways of complaining about that. You can go to broadcasters, and if you're not satisfied with that outcome, you can complain to the Australian Communications and Media Authority. They can investigate under codes of practice, and if you find something on a news site or in newspapers, you can go to the Australian Press Council. And I think while those forums receive a bit of a bad rap from time to time, it's important actually that people do use them, and that we kind of continue this cycle of ensuring that that responsible news producers both we work on aspects like business models to try to improve their viability, but we also keep in mind that aspect that public good function requires certain levels of professionalism as well, and that it's entirely reasonable to to monitor that and to call out pregnant problems with it.
Well, thank you so much. We've had a comment here from Herbert in Canberra saying, thanks a lot for a powerful discussion, have learnt a lot. And I think that was really the shared intention in all of us coming together, really to be able to draw on the Facebook news ban that occurred as a springboard for this bigger conversation to really unpack what happened, lessons learned, and really how we would shape the path ahead. So really on behalf of every participant who's joined today, and of course the Baha'i community who brought together everyone this afternoon, I'd like to thank you all for your generous contributions in lending your insights to this conversation. We all appreciate that this is an ongoing conversation, and without doubt, this exploration today has been a great source of knowledge and understanding in better unpacking these issues and the impact of digital disruption and the vital role of the media in our society. Indeed, the media is a form of education. It generates knowledge for the benefit of the whole at its best. And we really hope that this space has helped to bridge that divide that can often permeate in our society between communities and individuals and this institution that really at its heart seeks to be a public good and serve all of society towards that collective aspiration, which is the generation and diffusion of knowledge. We're getting a lot of comments here. Everyone's saying, thank you, it helped me. That's really what was at the heart of this conversation. Fascinating and important stuff. So lots of great feedback from you all. Thank you for joining. And once again, our sincere gratitude to the panelists who joined us this afternoon.